On the 19th of April 1945, in the hills of eastern Austria, a German shell punched straight through a tank from front to back. It went in through the fighting compartment and out through the engine. The driver died where he sat. The company commander, a man named Sasha Ionov, lost his right leg. The gunner, Lesha Romashkin, lost both of his legs. Weeks later, unable to face what was left of his life, Romashkin took his own pistol and ended it. The man who lived to tell this story was the tank commander. His name was Dmitriy Loza. He was a captain in the Red Army, and he had ridden this same machine across half of Europe. Here is the strange part. The tank that carried Loza into the last weeks of the war, the tank these guardsmen fought and bled and died inside, was not Soviet at all. It was American. It was a Sherman. And not just any Sherman. It was a model the United States Army looked at, shrugged, and decided it did not really want for itself. So it shipped them east. Thousands of them. And the men who took the cast-offs were the elite tank crews of the Red Army. This is the story of the tank the Americans set aside, the tank the Soviets renamed, and the long road it took from a factory in Detroit to the burning streets of Berlin and the dust of Manchuria. This is the story of the Emcha. Let me start with a simple question. Why did the United States have a Sherman it did not want? The answer is fuel. Most American Shermans ran on gasoline. They used a radial aircraft engine, or later a big multi-bank gasoline engine. And gasoline was what the American supply system was built to deliver across the Pacific and across France. But there was one version that was different. It was called the M4A2. Instead of gasoline, it ran on diesel. It used a General Motors power pack, two straight-six diesel engines bolted together, making around 400 horsepower. The American Army did not love diesel for its own tank divisions. It meant a second kind of fuel in the supply chain, and the Army wanted to keep things simple. So the diesel Sherman became the odd one out. It was the variant America was happy to send to someone else. And someone else wanted it badly. The Soviet Union ran its tanks on diesel. The famous T-34 ran on diesel. Soviet supply depots were already full of it. For the Red Army, a diesel Sherman was not a problem. It was a perfect fit. There was more to it than fuel. A diesel tank is harder to set on fire than a gasoline tank. Diesel does not throw off vapor the way gasoline does. For men who had watched crews burn alive, that mattered. There was one more reason the diesel Sherman looked so good. The Soviets had already been handed an American tank they hated. Before the Sherman, the United States sent the Red Army the M3. It was a strange tool machine with two guns, a small one in a turret on top and a big one stuck in the side of the hull. To aim that big gun, you often had to turn the whole tank. It stood high off the ground, an easy target. Its armor was thin and bolted upright instead of sloped. Its ammunition sat unprotected. And it ran on gasoline, with a rubber lining inside that gave off poison fumes and caught fire when the tank was hit. Soviet crews gave it a grim nickname. They called it the Grave for Seven Brothers, after its seven-man crew. It was a coffin with tracks. So by the time the diesel Sherman showed up, the Red Army already knew what a bad American tank felt like. That made the good ones stand out even more. So when the first small batch arrived, just 26 tanks in early 1942, Soviet officers looked them over with real interest. They saw the sloped front armor, they felt the smooth engine, and they sent word back up the chain. Send us more of these, send us the diesel ones, and only the diesel ones. The Americans were glad to oblige. Now the soldiers needed a name for it. On the side of every tank was the marking M4. To a Russian eye, the letter M was easy. They read it as M. But the number 4, written in a certain style, looked like a letter from their own alphabet, a letter that makes a soft cha sound. So they did not say M4, they said Emcha. Emcha. The name stuck. Across the whole Red Army, the American Sherman became the Emcha, and the men who crewed it became Emcha men. It was an affectionate name, a name you give a thing you have come to trust. Let me give you the numbers. because the numbers tell their own story. Over the course of the war, the United States set aside 4,102 of these diesel Shermans for the Soviet Union. But not all of them arrived. The sea route ran through freezing waters where German U-boats waited. Many of these tanks went to the bottom of the ocean before they ever fired a shot. In the end, around 3,664 reached Soviet ports. Of those, a little over 2,500 actually made it into frontline units. It is worth stopping on those losses for a moment, because getting a tank to the Soviet Union was its own kind of battle. There were three main roads for Lend-Lease, and none of them was easy. The first was the Arctic route, by ship around the top of Norway to the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. This was the deadliest path. German U-boats and bombers hunted these convoys through freezing seas, and many a Sherman went down in the dark water with the merchant ship that carried it. The second road was the Persian corridor, where cargo landed in the Persian Gulf and was hauled north through Iran by truck and rail into the Soviet South. The third ran across the Pacific to Vladivostok in the Far East. So an American tank built in Detroit might travel halfway around the planet, dodging submarines the whole way, just to reach the front. The tanks that arrived were the survivors of that journey before they ever met a German. The early tanks carried a 75mm gun. That was the standard Sherman gun, good against soft targets and fortifications, weaker against thick armor. But later, the picture changed. More than 2,000 of the Emchas that reached the Soviet Union carried the upgraded 76mm gun, with a longer barrel and far more punch. This later model also carried its ammunition in water-protected bins, which made it slower to catch fire when hit. The most common Soviet Sherman of all was this upgraded type, the M4A2 with the 76mm gun. So picture it. By the last year of the war, Soviet Guards units were rolling toward Germany in American-built tanks with a decent gun and a quiet diesel engine. Now, here is what surprised everyone. The Soviet crews did not just tolerate the Emcha, many of them came to prefer it over their own tanks for daily life and fighting. Listen to what Dmitriy Loza himself said about it, because he commanded these tanks for years, and he did not hand out praise lightly. Start with the radios. Loza said the Sherman carried 2 radio sets, both of very good quality. One for talking to the brigade, one for talking inside his own battalion. On top of that was a clean, clear intercom, so the crew could hear each other over the engine. For a tank commander, good radios are not a luxury. They are the difference between a coordinated attack and 5 tanks blundering forward alone. Soviet tanks of the time were often far behind on radios. The Emcha felt like a gift. Then the sight. The commander's main sight was set down into the turret roof, tucked away and protected from the weather. Snow did not pile on it, dust did not blind it. Loza said it stayed clear when other designs went blind. Then the tracks, and this is the detail Loza loved most. The Sherman ran on tracks with rubber pads built into them. On a hard road, this changed everything. Loza said the Sherman drove like a car on a firm surface. It was quiet. He said his own T-34 made so much noise that the devil only knew how many kilometers away the enemy could hear it coming. The Emcha could sneak. And those rubber tracks lasted. A Soviet T-34 track might be worn out after 2,500 kilometers. The Sherman's tracks could run for more than 5,000. For an army that fought across enormous distances, a tank that did not constantly need new tracks was worth a great deal. It went on. Loza marveled at the seats, covered in a tough artificial leather, so nice the men called the interior a finished apartment. He marveled at the ammunition, which arrived clean and shining in cardboard tubes, 3 rounds banded together, ready to use. Soviet shells came smeared in thick grease that took hours to wipe off before a battle. The American rounds you could almost load straight from the box. There was even a tiny extra engine, small as a motorcycle motor, whose only job was to charge the batteries. That meant the crew did not have to fire up the big diesel just to keep their radios and lights alive. They could sit quiet and hidden and still keep power. For a man who had fought the early war in rougher machines, the Emcha felt like the future. But Loza was an honest soldier, and he did not pretend the tank was perfect. It had real flaws, and some of them could kill you. The biggest was the shape. The Sherman was tall, and its weight sat high. That gave it a high center of gravity. Loza said it tipped over on its side easily, like a matryoshka doll, those wooden nesting dolls that wobble and fall. You would think that is just an annoyance, but it cut both ways. In December of 1944, in Hungary, Loza's own driver clipped a curb at the edge of a road. The tank rolled onto its side. It must have felt like a disaster, but the 4 tanks ahead of his kept driving straight into a German ambush, and they were destroyed. Loza, stuck on his side at the curb, lived. The very flaw that frightened him saved his life that day. There was a worse problem, and it came from those beloved rubber tracks. In August of 1944, during the great Soviet attack into Romania, Loza's corps was driving hard in summer heat, around 30 degrees on the Celsius scale. After about 100 kilometers of this, the rubber linings on the road wheels got so hot they began to come apart. The rubber peeled off in long strips and jammed the wheels. Near Bucharest, this brought the advance to a halt, not because of the Germans, but because the tanks were cooking themselves. Then there was ice. On a slick surface, Loza said, the Shermans slid around like a fat cow. The crews improvised. They wrapped barbed wire around the tracks for grip, or bolted on homemade cleats. Later, the Americans sent proper track blocks with metal spikes, 7 on each track, 14 in all, and that helped the tank hold the road in winter. Even the hatches taught a lesson. On the early tanks, the driver's hatch opened straight up out of the roof. If the turret swung around at the wrong moment, it could slam into the open hatch and crack the driver on the head. The Americans later fixed it so the hatch lifted and then slid to the side. Small thing, but in a tank, small things break bones. So that was the Emcha, a comfortable, quiet, well-built tank with good radios and a decent gun that you had to respect on slopes, baby in the heat, and spike for the ice. Now let me be fair, because this was not a case of the American tank simply beating the Soviet one. The T-34 had real advantages of its own, and the men knew it. The T-34 had wide tracks. Where the narrow Shermans sank and slid in deep mud and snow, the broad Soviet tracks floated over it. On the worst ground of the Eastern Front, that mattered enormously. The T-34 also had beautifully sloped armour that could bounce a shot, and it was simpler and cheaper to build by the tens of thousands, which is exactly what a country fighting for its life needed. So the truth is that the 2 tanks were good at different things. The T-34 was the better tank for the brutal mud and the mass production line. The Sherman was the better tank to actually live and fight inside. A Soviet crewman did not always get to choose, but the ones who rode the Emcha often felt they had drawn a lucky hand. Now, who got these tanks? Not just anybody. The Sherman went to the Guards. In the Red Army, the word Guards was not decoration, it was earned. A Guards unit was an elite formation, given the best men, and often the best equipment, and trusted with the hardest jobs. The Emchas flowed to the Guards' mechanized corps, the spear point units meant to punch through and race deep into the enemy rear. Loza himself rose to command the 1st Tank Battalion of the 46th Guards Tank Brigade, part of the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps. His tank carried the number 936 and the words, "For the Motherland," painted on the side. Other Guards Corps took the Sherman too. The 1st Guards Mechanized Corps would carry their Emchas all the way into the street fighting of Berlin. The 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps would take theirs to the far side of the world, into Manchuria. Wherever the Red Army needed a fast, reliable, hard-hitting force, the American tank was there in Soviet colors. But there was a problem these elite crews had to solve. The German heavy tanks, the Tigers and the Panthers, were dangerous beasts. A Tiger could kill a Sherman from far away before the Sherman's gun could do much in return. So the Emcha men did not fight fair, they fought smart. Loza described the method, and he gave it a hunter's name. He called it hunting with Borzois, after the long-legged Russian hounds that bring down a wolf in a pack, not one-on-one. Against a single Tiger, he sent 2 Shermans, not 1. The first Sherman would aim low and fire at the tracks, trying to break a track and stop the Tiger from turning. A pinned Tiger is a Tiger that cannot keep its thick front armor facing the danger. At that moment, the second Sherman would slip to the side and fire into the Tiger's flank, where the armor was thinner, aiming for the fuel and the engine. 1 tank to pin, 1 tank to kill. 2 hounds and a wolf. It was not glamorous, but it worked, and it kept Soviet crews alive against an enemy that outgunned them head to head. Now, let me bring you to where all of this collided. The spring of 1945. The German antagonist worthy of the name, the Waffen-SS. By March of 1945, Hitler had gathered his best remaining armor in Hungary for one last great attack near Lake Balaton. The force at the heart of it was the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich. Inside it were the most famous and most feared SS tank divisions, units like the Leibstandarte, the Das Reich, and the Totenkopf. These were the prestige formations of the Nazi state, the ones that had led the way in earlier years. The attack failed. The Soviets held, then broke the German line, and Hitler's last great armoured fist was spent. What came next was the Vienna offensive in April of 1945. The shattered 6th SS Panzer Army fell back toward the Austrian capital, and the Soviet Guards came after them. Among those Guards, in their American-built Shermans, was Dmitriy Loza and the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps. So picture the inversion. The proud SS Panzer divisions, the units that had once mocked everyone, were now in full retreat. And the men chasing them, pressing into the wreck of the Reich, did it in American-built Shermans. Hitler was so enraged by the failure of his SS favourites in Hungary that he ordered them to remove the cuff titles from their sleeves, the bands of cloth that carried their unit names. It was meant as a humiliation. The proudest soldiers in his army, stripped of their names, running from Soviet tankers in American-built Shermans. Loza earned the highest honour his country could give in this fight. Commanding an understrength Sherman force, he seized a vital rail junction on the road to Vienna, the kind of choke point that can decide whether a retreat becomes a rout. For that, he was named a hero of the Soviet Union. The fighting in and around the city was close and ugly. Loza remembered one moment that shows what street combat really looked like. A Soviet heavy assault gun, an ISU-152, fired at a German Panther tank from a few hundred meters down a street. The shell was so heavy that the Panther's turret tore clean off the hull and dropped onto the pavement nearby. But the blast also shattered the old leaded glass windows in the buildings all around, and the falling shards rained down on Loza's own infantry, cutting their arms and shoulders even through their helmets. That was the city fight. Even a victory could wound the men who won it. The Emcha men improvised to keep moving. When they punched deep into the German rear and ran low on diesel, Loza's crews once mixed gasoline and kerosene together to feed their diesel engines and keep rolling. The engines overheated and complained, but the tanks kept going. That was the spirit of the advance. whatever it took to keep the spearhead moving forward. But do not let me make it sound clean, because it was not. Remember the 19th of April. Remember the shell that went through the tank from front to back. Remember the driver who died at his controls, and Ionov who lost his leg, and Romashkin who lost both of his and could not go on. The Emcha was comfortable. The Emcha had good radios and a clean sight, and seats like an apartment. None of that stopped a Tiger's round. The men inside these American tanks paid in Soviet blood for every kilometre of that last spring. The tank was a tool, the courage was theirs. And the road did not end at Vienna. Far to the north, in the same weeks, the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps drove their Shermans into Berlin itself, into the narrow streets where every window could hide a Panzerfaust and a teenage soldier with nothing left to lose. Street fighting eats tanks. That corps lost around half of its Shermans in the battle for the German capital. So the Emcha did not stop at Vienna and the 6th SS Panzer Army. American-built Shermans, crewed by Soviet guardsmen, fought and burned in the last battle of the European War, in the heart of Hitler's own city. But the Emcha had one more campaign left in it, and it was on the other side of the world. When Germany surrendered, the Soviet Union turned east toward Japan. In August of 1945, the Red Army launched a massive invasion of Manchuria to destroy Japan's Kwantung Army, and the Sherman went along for the ride. The 3rd and the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps, Emcha units, took part in that lightning campaign across the mountains and deserts of the Far East. There was little tank against tank fighting there. The Japanese armor was light and outmatched, and the Soviet advance moved too fast for much of a battle to form. But it is worth pausing on the picture. An American diesel Sherman crossing the dust of Manchuria under a red star in the very last campaign of the Second World War. And then, almost as quietly as it arrived, the Emcha vanished from the Soviet story. After the war, by the terms of the Lend-Lease program, the Americans wanted their equipment back, or wanted to be paid for it. According to Loza, the Soviets at first prepared to ship the tanks home. But then, the story goes, Stalin grew angry at how the Americans were handling returned aircraft, scrapping them rather than reusing them. So Stalin gave his own order. Strip the remaining Shermans. The guns and turrets went into storage. The hulls were stripped down and turned to civilian use. The tank that the Americans had set aside, that the Soviets had renamed and loved and bled inside, was taken apart by the same army it had served. So what is the verdict on the Emcha? It was never the most powerful tank on the battlefield. It did not have the thickest armor or the biggest gun. The Tiger outgunned it. The flaws were real, the high center of gravity, the rubber that cooked in the heat, the slide on the ice. But ask a man who actually rode it into battle, and you get a different answer. Loza did not measure the tank only by its armor. He measured it by the radios that let him command, by the sight that did not blind him in the snow, by the engine quiet enough to surprise the enemy, by the tracks that carried him 5,000 kilometers, by the diesel that was slower to burn. He measured it by the men it brought home. America built the Sherman and then handed this particular version to someone else, almost as an afterthought. The Red Army took that afterthought, named it the Emcha, gave it to its best crews, and drove it into Vienna, into Berlin, and across Manchuria. The Germans who first saw these tanks may have laughed at a cast-off American machine in Soviet hands. They were not laughing when the Emcha men came through the rubble of the Reich, hunting their tigers in pairs, 2 hounds to a wolf, all the way to the end.